Greetings from Erie, your honorary home as an honorary citizen. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor and members of the Gannon community and the Erie community and the Jefferson community for having this program, for having me and virtually Deb back again one more time. Thank you, Ferky. It was such a pleasure to see Katya and your two wonderful sons earlier. Deb and I raised two boys. It's a character building experience, as many of you know, so we are glad to see this torch being passed. I'm particularly grateful to the people you're going to be hearing from after I give my opening presentation, who are living the realities of small town renewal. I'm talking about your own Ben Speggen, who's going to be leading the panel. You know Ben very well. I'll tell you about some of the ways we're working with Ben, but also Isaac and Heidi Tucker, who have come here from Dillsburg, Pennsylvania, where they have a very interesting saga. Jason Nisus, who's come here from Dubuque, Iowa, and Alice Trowbridge, who's come here from Williamsport. They're all part of a new program I'm going to be telling you about. Overall, the goal in any kind of public presentation is to leave you knowing something you might not have known before. And I think the kinds of programs that my colleagues are going to be talking about, as in the last couple of years, as Deb and I have learned about them, they have told us new things. We're going to try to tell you some new things too. I'm going to give a word of introduction about the connection between our family, Deb and me, and the city of Erie and the institutions here, including the Jefferson Society and the universities and the rest of your establishment. The first time we came to Erie was now a little more than 6 years ago. And the occasion was Deb had been invited to give a speech for the Jefferson Educational Society about libraries and the future of libraries, which she had been writing about on the basis of our travels around the country. I was dropping her off. I was using our little airplane to spend the following week at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, if this gives you some idea of the timing and of this whole exercise. But it was so interesting to go to the microbreweries here and to hang around and meet friends. We thought, we need to come back. And we did come back many times. And over the next couple of years, we made a number of visits for reporting, for making friendships, for learning about things we could share with the readership. And to our great honor to be here now, I think 5 years ago, to become honorary citizens of Erie and to receive we're extremely touched to receive the Tom Hagen Awards. That evening, were any of you here that evening 5 years ago? You recall that Deb and I got two wonderful commemorative statues about honoring our award. Mine was of a sort of doddering-looking Cicero, and who was sort of having his observations about the world. And Deb's was Athena, resplendent with a spear and about twice as big as the Cicero figure and all the rest. We have them both at our home in DC. We look at them as if they were kinds of mirrors of our reality, looking to them. We've spoken at the Global Summit, and we are very glad to have maintained ties with Erie and to have shared your story. We did write about Erie in our book, and I think we actually mentioned it in our movie, although the filmmakers weren't here. But we have dozens of times, probably scores of times now, talked around the country at events about how people can look to Erie and the way it has had a realistic and clear-eyed but idealistic assessment of where it is in life, where it can go, and how to put its assets to use. So we have tried to tell Erie's story. We're going to try to learn more about it, and so that is why we're glad to be here. I'll say one other connection. Ferky and Dr. Taylor mentioned the new foundation we have set up, the Our Towns Civic Foundation, which I'll turn back to. The two crucial allies and colleagues and partners we have in that are, again, your own Ben Speggen, who is leading our editorial direction, and Michelle Elliott, who is our technical and all others and design and all-purpose whiz. So we are connected every day with Erie in spirit and through personality. So here's what my plan for the next while before Ben and our four colleagues discuss what they're doing around the country. I'm going to talk briefly in 4 stages. I'm going to say first a reminder of where we went. We in this case means Deb and I, and how we came to Erie in the first place and to places like Erie over the years. So where we went. Then I'm going to talk briefly about what we saw and learned, and how our view of America and the American media and American civic culture and America's future was affected by a number of years, again, coming to places like this. Then I'm going to say something about what we are doing now. And the we here is not just Deb and me, but also Ben and Michelle and our colleagues around the country. And then I'm going to finally talk briefly where this leaves us. And the us in this case is the United States. So it's about where we went, Deb and me, what we saw, again, the two of us, then what we're doing, our new team, and then where this leaves us, all of us as Americans. So that's the plan for the next while. So first on where we went, I'll give a condensed for the quickest way, if you'd like to catch up on the story of this journey, is who here subscribes to HBO Max or has any kind of HBO sign up. HBO is still running this movie, Our Towns, which is a 97-minute documentary, which is absolutely beautiful. Here's a secret which we can turn off the live stream for the next 10 seconds. You can get a free trial of HBO Max for 1 month, and they'll never know. So, okay, we're now back on the record again. What that movie encapsulated was what we talked about the last time we were at the Global Summit, which was beginning in 2012, when Deb and I returned to the U.S. after a number of years of living in China and trying to report on China by going to smaller places outside Beijing and Shanghai, places that weren't usually in the news, and saying, what's it like in a small town of 4 million people as it tries to make its way in the world? What's it like, on the scale of things in China? And we thought when we came back to the U.S., even though our home is in Washington, D.C., which has become a better and better place to live over the years, that my colleagues in the media sort of systematically underreported and misreported the realities of America outside D.C. and New York and Seattle and Los Angeles and San Francisco and a few other major places. That big cities are often reported in their full three-dimensional complexity, and the rest of America is often just kind of two-dimensional backdrop or one-dimensional backdrop, and it's summed up as either how the whole state votes one way or another for senators or for national elections, and not as places where real people, with all their nuances and their complexities and their contradictions, are making their way together and making their way forward, and sometimes being set back. So over a number of years, Deb and I traveled in our little single-engine propeller plane. I need to point this out to avoid sort of the Gulf Stream image here, to places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Fresno, California, and Erie, and Columbus, Mississippi, and about 25 places in some depth, and about more than 50 places overall. We did this in hundreds of articles online for The Atlantic and elsewhere. We did it in our book, which was published in 2018 and did become a national bestseller, and as remains, as we see from our royalty statements, is still out there in the world. We had the very good fortune that just as the book was being published, the then head of HBO, who was not listening to those 10 seconds earlier on, came to us and said they'd like to make a documentary about this. And so we spent most of the year of 2019 before the pandemic lockdown in 100 days of full-time shooting with a brilliantly talented film crew from HBO in 6 main places around the country. We all spent much of 2020 doing lockdown and doing sort of the post-production of that, doing the narration, doing the cutting, doing the genius compression work that really talented filmmakers do, to have half a second on screen convey something, a feeling, an impression, a kind of beauty that would take you 1,000 words to do, and you wouldn't convey it in the same way. And so that film came out about a year and a half ago, and we have, Deb and I are determined to continue this kind of mission, and I'll get to that later on. So where we went was around the country, and the main metric of cities we would go to is, you can see how this applies to a place like Erie. The question was, is this a place that would be in the news if something hadn't just gone wrong? If there hadn't been a tornado or some kind of tragedy or the Iowa caucuses, as Jason is familiar with, or other things that get attention. And so those were the stories we tried to tell. So that is the backdrop of thinking that this is a big, rich country in its complexity in which we're trying to convey. And what dumbfounded Deb and me as people from the written word world who have taken photos for a long time and done short video clips was the way in which, again, the different sort of impression that talented movie makers can make in giving you some idea of reality that you couldn't have conveyed anywhere else. So that's part one. Where we went, what we saw not the real America, but sort of the because there's no one real America, but the smaller town realities of our country. Second, in brief, what we learned. The policy summary vision of what we learned is something that I remember is the kind of thing I would have written. I'll mention Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's been here many times. When I was a senior in college, she had just left the White House Fellowship with LBJ and was the teaching assistant in this course I took in college on American politics. And I would have to write things for her, trying to distill things down to the clear essence. The clear essence of what we saw is that America looks better the closer up you get. And it looks worse and most disturbing the farther away you look at it. I think this is the opposite of what we ended up saying about China. China looks most intimidating and formidable the farther away you're seeing it, saying, oh my God, these high-speed railroads, oh my God, all the other things they're doing. The closer you get, the more complex and fragile it seems. For America, our problems are evident from the large, distant view, as we all know. But we were saying, again, from places like Erie, the closer you look, the more you see people caring and cooperating and thinking in sophisticated ways, and that people are smart around the country. People are not crazy or rubes, or people are smart and complex. Deb and I both came from sort of underappreciated smaller towns. So this was a perspective that came naturally to us. And we ended up thinking that it was important for America at this stage of its development to have a clearer version of itself, of its own story. Now, the stories that people tell as individuals, as families, as institutions, as societies, those stories matter. And we know the American story with its idealism and its horrors. We know how America is striving to certain things and always in various ways falling short. We thought the current American story was really being misunderstood or misrepresented by most of our colleagues in the press, because the story that comes across about most of the country, about the country as a whole, is division, paralysis, impending civil war, all the other things you see on TV every night and read in the papers every day, which is not the way it generally seems place by place. There was a fascinating poll just a month ago now from Gallup, asking people, it's part of a long-running series from Gallup, how people feel about themselves and their communities, how they feel about the country. How people feel about themselves and their communities is near an all-time high. It's about 85% of the people said they felt as if their own lives were basically in the positive rather than negative direction. And by extension, their own communities were in that direction too. Whereas the same 85% thought the country as a whole was headed straight down. And partly that's because there are national level crises that people recognize, but partly it's because the difference of what you experience and what you see on cable news. And so bridging that gap is part of what we wanted to do. And there are a million other things we saw and we laid out in a very long book. But I think the essence of what we saw and believed and wanted to share is that there is the all around the country, at times of national level distress that we're so familiar with, there is this diaspora of people trying their best and people coming up with new ideas, and the potential of another reform movement taking shape. I don't mean reform in the sort of standard left, right, Democratic, Republican way. I mean a sense of people being able to make progress and feeling as if there's a problem, we'll address it, we can do something about it. And people recognizing that is something that seemed important. So part two, what we learned. We learned about that difference in America's face when seen on cable news versus seen neighborhood by neighborhood. Part three, briefly, so what we are doing now. So when the HBO movie came out a year and a half ago, Deb and I also believed that it was important to try to do something about this misapprehension the United States Americans had about their country. Try to find some ways to connect people around the country who were doing similar-minded things, allow them to learn from one another, and to allow them, I'll pause for a moment, respectfully for the chimes, and that also reminds me that I'm getting near the end of this talk. So we thought it was, well, what is the done thing? Does one? It's not going to count them off? Okay. That gives me another 15 seconds to work with. So it's, oh, it is? What kind of eerie guy are you? So, I'm going to have this as background B-roll music. That is, there was a musical score to our movie. It was specially composed by an award-winning composer. So imagine it that way. So, So after, in the year or so between, in the 2 year, the year and a half between when our book came out and when there was the COVID lockdown, we talked to all kinds of groups around the country, mayors groups, Congress people, senators, civic groups, whatever, and we sensed there was a real hunger from people around the country to make this kind of connection. And we started our Towns Foundation essentially to give a voice and connection and platform to people wanting to tell the real stories of their communities around the country in a way that the mainstream media were not going to pay as much attention to. We have a number of special projects. We've been doing this, local level initiatives for environmental sustainability and using new mapping tools, so from the Esri Mapping Company, which is as it happens, from my hometown in Redlands, trying to find ways to revive local journalism and have new ways to deal with that, trying to deal with the rural-urban divide we hear so much about. But one of our most important special projects is the one that I'm going to introduce you with Ben and the panel, which is a partnership with the Community Heart and Soul organization, which is based in Burlington, Vermont. How many of you know about Community Heart and Soul? So I'm glad to see our panelists are raising their that is a relief. So that's one step. I'm glad to see that only a few people raise their hands in the rest of the audience, because there's the potential to tell you something that may be valuable. What is great about Community Heart and Soul, which you're going to hear from Ben and Isaac and Heidi and Jason and Alice in just a minute, is the way it has come up with an actual process to have people deal with their local level challenges and make something better of them. It is not like something you've seen discussed, of having people who are right-wing and left-wing have dinner together, or these other sort of symbolic efforts, but it's actually dealing with the challenges of the community. And Deb and I have been very impressed with what they're doing. We try to tell their story, and so you're going to hear more about that in a moment. Just another 1 minute from me, then I'll give it to Ben and the panel. This is the promised part 4 of where this leaves us as the community. I think there may be in the U.S. over the last couple of years, our friends in the D.C. media have been skeptical when we've tried to say, look, if you go around the country, you will find this is a complicated place. People have different views. People, again, there are some people who are simplistic and are zealots or whatever, but most people can listen to most discussions, and they have, their life stories are interesting. People are smart rather than not being smart. And I think that it's been the tendency in the national media just, again, to simplify everything to how you're going to vote in the next presidential election. I think in the last couple of days, you saw the national media almost all predicting one outcome, with tremendous certainty, and then saying, oh, well, this is not quite what we thought. There is a little bit more complexity here. And so maybe there will be an appetite again from the national media to say, what else is going on in the rest of the country that we're not going to learn by just going to a diner someplace and finding somebody who has complaints, but rather seeing how communities are actually functioning and how they're addressing their problems. So if the meta theme of our book and movie and our posts has been, America has always been in trouble, but the story of any given decade in American life is how the getting out of trouble part of the equation balances the in trouble part of the equation. And it's an endless balance, and we're seeing that play out now. And so that is what I think where it leaves us is recognizing we have challenges and we have resources. And the challenge is to put those resources to use. It also depends on knowing some place where you can start, a place to make a beginning and have a plan of where to go. And that is the direct connection to Ben Speggen and Isaac and Heidi and Jason and Alice, who are going to tell you about the ways they are doing this in their communities. So Ben will lead that discussion. Then we'll all come back for questions from you. But meanwhile, I bring greetings from Deb and our gratitude as fellow Erieites.
As we all start to take our seats, how about one more round of applause for James Fallows, honorary Erie citizen. And if we learned anything too, we'll also we'll make sure that we importantly start this segment as well with hi Deb, tuning in virtually. Also hi to some of the community heart and soul networks, the towns where we're seeing this process play out, tuning in, folks from across the country, a uniting effort. And here we get a chance to talk about what that looks like. So I have plenty of questions that I'm gonna run through with our panelists here. Ask them to tell us a little bit about their towns, and then dive into the process, how it's working, how it's playing out. But of course, we welcome your questions as well. If you did not get an index card and a golf pencil on the way through, in-person audience, just simply wave your hand. One of our helpful team members at the JES will be sure to get that for you. And we will collect those a bit later. We'll welcome Jim back into that conversation to be able to do that. I think one of the remarkable things that came out of Jim's initial setup here to then lead us to this conversation is, unfortunately, too often, small towns, smaller cities are portrayed as one-dimensional, two-dimensional. And so I know folks are often eager to ask, what do you think about Erie? When we have panelists from outside of Erie, you all have been here a few hours and had a chance to experience it. I'm sure somebody will ask, what do you think of Erie? But before you get a chance to answer that later, we'll ask you to give us a little bit of insight into your town and the work you do. And with us on the panel to introduce them, we have Jason Nisis here. And Jason is the Community Development Coordinator at the Community Foundation of Greater Dubuque. And we have Allison Trowbridge, who is a project coordinator and coaching several different towns with Community Heart and Souls through PA Humanities. Those towns are Ambridge, Carbondale, and Wyoming County. Then we have with us too Isaac and Heidi Tucker. And we have them as residents of Dillsburg because in this panel discussion, we'll talk about the layers of community heart and soul, those who have helped really propagate this with perhaps a larger institution like a foundation or PA Humanities, those who have coached it as well, both Jason and Alice, and also an opportunity to talk to those who are living it at the street level in the town that they reside. Isaac and Heidi, who are also small business owners, have full-time jobs, are full-time parents, and do so much more for Dillsburg, Pennsylvania. We'll get into that more in a bit. Jason, because you're simply sitting next to me, I'd like to start with you. Easiest way to walk this down. As we start to talk about community heart and soul, first tell us a little bit about your neck of the woods and why such a model would work, defining why it's applicable to Dubuque and beyond, a community resident-driven model. So first, your towns that you're working with, and then a bit about community heart and soul. Alice, the same to you, and then we'll talk about Dillsburg.
So I work with the Community Foundation of Greater Dubuque, and we are a philanthropic organization that's dedicated to strengthening communities and inspiring giving in our region, so we're all about philanthropy. So one of the reasons we chose to work with Heart and Soul is that we work in a 7-county region, most of which is very rural. And to do our philanthropic work well, we knew we needed to strengthen our relationships with leadership and residents in those regions to really understand their needs. And there's no better way of doing that than a program like Heart and Soul. It's easy to go into a town and interview the mayor and talk to the city council folks and maybe talk to some nonprofit leaders, but how do you know what residents really need? Heart and Soul is designed to do that, so that's why we as a foundation chose to do it, because it's a way that we can get meaningful information from residents themselves, and also finding the missing voices. One of the critical parts about Heart and Soul is that it's not just that top-level leadership. It really is trying to find people who often aren't heard in typical planning processes. So how are youth represented? How are non-native residents represented? How are maybe refugees or immigrants or people like that represented in typical town planning efforts? It's minimal, it's hard to find those folks. So Heart and Soul is good at that. So we adopted it to do that, to help us strengthen those relationships. We also know that some of the biggest challenges our small towns face are how do we build the capacity for the nonprofits that do work in those small towns. It's a key sign of strength when you have strong nonprofits in a small town. So as a foundation, we're interested in that. We also know that we need to cultivate emerging leaders in small towns. When you go to the library board meeting or the conservation commission or those kinds of things, when you look at who's on those commissions in many small towns, first of all, they're not very representative of the residents, and second of all, most of them are older. So what's that next generation kind of coming up to fill those roles? So we saw Heart and Soul as a way to do that. We're also very interested in building a stronger sense of regional identity among the 7 counties that we work in. So the more that I'm out on the road, working in small towns, helping small towns connect with each other and share resources is something that we're very interested in as a foundation. So.
And what I like about that, Jason, is it's meet the people where they are rather than try to get the people to come to you. And speaking truth to power, that's one of the things that Michelle and I had seen in a reporting trip to South Carolina, in that meeting residents, they tried to find so many different ways to engage, and that including having a pop-up tent at a Dollar General parking lot, because that's where people were. So you go where they are. Alice, take us to where you are. You're in Williamsport now, but you're also working in various other communities in the state of Pennsylvania. What does Community Heart and Soul look like in your towns? What do your towns look like right now?
Okay. In Williamsport, we have gone through the full process, and we're now at a point where we're starting to see how it's been embedded in the community as a way of doing business differently. This summer, for example, our chief of police decided he wanted to have more transparency and he wanted to build relationships between people in the neighborhoods and the authority figures so they took a grill and they had EMTs and police officers in plain clothes take that grill to the neighborhoods, hand out hot dogs and say, what's it like living in your neighborhood? What would you like us to know about what it's like living here? So when we come here to help you with something, you know, what should we understand? Those are the kind of things that come out of this process that are just so rewarding and so rich, and it's about building relationships in a community.
And I think that what is heartening about that is finding creative ways to get people to interact together who are in the community together anyway, finding a way to do that commonly, you know, bringing people around a grill. Isaac and Heidi, you've brought people around a table, so you're doing plenty in your community. In Dillsburg, in case anybody was curious, yes, they do have a pickle fest. No, it is not named after a pickle. The town itself, Matthew Dill. We have more about that at the OurTownsFoundation.org. But Isaac and Heidi, take us to Dillsburg for a second, and I think it's important to note, Isaac, you're an elected representative. You're on borough council. You wanted to get involved in your community and move the needle that way, yet perhaps that wasn't enough, and you had to do something different, thus Community Heart and Soul.
Yeah, so both of us grew up in the town of the Pickle. It was a mascot we adopted in the 80s, I think, through a business association. Yeah, we drop it at New Year's. It's a fun time. Yeah, so we grew up in this town and fell in love with it, just like a lot of folks do. And we moved away after college and found a really awesome town called Franklin, Tennessee, if everyone's been to Franklin, Tennessee. And we were very inspired by what a small town could be. And we came back to Dillsburg and said, we can make Dillsburg cool. It's taking a lot longer than we had hoped, but we're trying very hard. So I decided to, it actually started out as a joke. People used to call me the mayor, and they said, you know, you should run for mayor. And I looked into it, and I was like, oh, mayor doesn't actually get to vote, so maybe I'll run for council. So I did that, and they let me become a council member. I'm just started my second term. It's been very enlightening and not the vessel of change that I thought it would be. Yes, the dining room table scene took place a little bit after being elected, and we had a number of folks out of our community who were really interested in the same stuff we were and said, oh my gosh, Isaac and Heidi are really wanting to move the needle in the town. Let's see how we can get involved. Realtors, different pastors, and folks who have been embedded in the community for years, part of the Lions Club and all of the nonprofits in our town who are doing great work, but as you've seen across the country, volunteerism is at an all-time low, and it's very difficult to find folks to step up to the plate and spend some time, and with kids, it's also very challenging to find time to do stuff. So we got together and started trying to come up with a plan. How do we do this? What does it look like? What is missing? Why do we feel like we're not being heard or that there's something better out there for our town? And that's kind of when Heart and Soul found us, I guess, is the next part of that story. But
And so I want to get to that story, and as a couple that gets a chance to work together, I love that you are also a couple that is working together in your community and sharing a microphone here on stage. So I was going to ask Isaac if you could hand that to Heidi, because Heidi, I was going to ask, what was it like? Whether the day you decided, okay, town, come over, come to our kitchen, our dining room table, let's have a conversation. Was that nerve-wracking, anxiety-driven? Were you hopeful, aspirational? What was that moment like? What were you hoping to get out of it? And then when dinner was done, when the talk was done, where did you feel like you were headed next?
So it was exciting. I think we were deciding, like, what we wanted to do was, like, as Jason pointed out, there's a lot of different organizations in our town still. There's like civic organizations, like Isaac said, but they are aging. And they're not as active, and for some reason, our generation, or even the generation between us and some of those folks, is just like non-existent as far as participating. And so we came up with this idea. We live in the downtown center of our tiny town, and we were really interested in economic revitalization of the downtown specifically. So we were like, we'll get a group together. We'll call it the Downtown Dillsburg Initiative, or the Dillsburg Downtown.
No, you said
that was
it
right. The Downtown Dillsburg Initiative. I always flip the two first words. And so we had this group of people. We had them come over when we remodeled our house. It's an old house. We made this big section, just one long dining room table, so we can fit like 14 eating, maybe like 16 people squeezed in there. And after meeting with that group, there was a lot of ideas. There was like project ideas. They're like, maybe we should do some murals, or maybe we should, just do more a community garden or something like that. But we had some friends from a neighboring town who actually did the Heart and Soul program. It was called the Greater Carlisle Heart and Soul, and they kind of ended up turning into Greater Carlisle, and then Mount Holly Springs, another neighboring small town, did the same Heart and Soul program, and they were like, I think you guys should do it in Dillsburg. And so that's kind of how we got started. We partnered with a local philanthropic, it's called South Mountain Partnership. They work with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy to give out grants, and so that's kind of how we got started. I mean, the reason we were interested in Heart and Soul specifically, though, was to find that common ground in our town, where a lot of times people are focused on their differences. This program is specifically like, let's hear everyone's voice, and let's find the 6 or 8 or 5 like common core values, like everyone who's here, who chose Dillsburg or like just stayed here for 60 years because they were born here, what do we have in common? And then also, I think someone already mentioned it, kind of managing resources and using resources wisely and kind of hearing from the people, what do they want? What are the issues? And then how do we, we're a small town, so how do we use our resources wisely to solve those actual problems?
And I think it's really important to note at this juncture that this was founded with that intention in mind. So a little bit of background on Community Heart and Soul is that Lyman Orton, who is the owner and operator of the Vermont Country Store, the purveyors of the unique and hard to find, that is still a lovely store, but also a successful mail catalog and successful online store that is now a generational business. He returned to his hometown and was getting involved in town initiatives and saw that there wasn't really a process and that it was hard to get the work done, hard to get people to the table to have conversations. And that led he and his family with the Orton Family Foundation to launch the Community Heart and Soul Initiative, with the aspirations of then showing that other towns and cities nationwide could adopt this and have similar successes. And Heidi, you mentioned that in your neck of the woods, there are several other towns that are practicing this model or have practiced this model. So Alice, I want to go back to you first and stay in Pennsylvania to talk about the role of PA Humanities in helping to see small towns in Pennsylvania actualize this. And then Jason, I want to turn to you and talk about the work that you're accomplishing a little farther west in the country with your foundation doing a similar model. So Alice, PA Humanities, what is the attraction and interest in a community revitalization process like Community Heart and Soul? Why help towns do this? Why be a champion for it?
Well, PA Humanities is one of 56 PA Humanity Councils across the United States, and they're the statewide partners of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And PA Humanities, they put people first. The work they do is focusing on people. It's not on projects, it's on people. And so they want to empower people through education, through meaningful conversations, to inspire them to take action. So it's not enough just to have the ideas, but it's like, how do we take action? And that's really where they came into Community Heart and Soul, because it is a process where it brings people together to talk about what really matters most to them on an emotional level. Talking about where you live, why is that important to you? How does that impact your life? It's not what potholes need to be fixed. And so in doing this, people start having a positive narrative about where they live, and they start to find a sense of place. And from that, want to be involved and get into action.
Well, and I think that's key to getting people to the table, is rather than focusing on the negative, what is wrong, it is one of there are three principles, and one of the principles is focus on the positive and to look at what's going right in your community, and then also what do people want in your community. Jason, what are you seeing with the work through the Community Foundation of Greater Dubuque in also helping to propagate this?
Well, similarly to what Alice was talking about, it was something that was attractive to us as well, is that it's a story-based process. It's getting people to tell their stories about what they care about. And then the nice thing is kind of what Isaac and Heidi were talking about, is once they tell their stories, we have a plan and a process that helps people make decisions about the future of their town based upon what they actually care about, not necessarily what this little bright shiny object that got dangled in front of a council member or something at some point. That's kind of what a lot of decision making in small towns is not terribly intentional. So this helps bring some intentionality to decision making, and if people hear their voices in the decisions that are being made, it's much more likely that they'll volunteer, that they'll get involved, that they'll be a part of the solution if they feel like they had some ownership over it. So that's really important to us, and why we choose it as a process, because we are an asset-based foundation. We want to make sure that we build these positive assets and use them and deploy them in ways that really make the biggest impact.
And so, in speaking of the process too, because it is a four-phased process that helps towns go through this together, and then remains open-ended, something that it can be revisited and built upon. I know that it is certainly not the case in a place like Erie, Pennsylvania, where no one would complain that there are plans done and then plans are finished and then they're put on a shelf and they collect dust and nothing ever happens until we decide we need another plan, and then another plan happens and we get in this cycle. I know we've broken that cycle here, maybe. I know we have, but to speak about the open-ended nature of this, of what it takes to bring people back to the table after you've gotten them once, because maybe once is not enough. Isaac and Heidi, you're walking this. Talk about what it's like to get people to continue to come back to be a part of this conversation.
Okay. I would say that is a challenge, to get people to understand that, just the scope of the project and the process, I guess I would say, and to understand that it's a project and not a new nonprofit. So that's what we've kind of run into a lot. Like, we, even with the Downtown Dillsburg initiative, we are trying not to be a new nonprofit. We tried to like become a subcommittee of another one just for like liability coverage. but with Heart and Soul, it's been, it's trying to get people to understand it's not a new group, it's a project to help the groups that already exist in town. And then as far as engaging with people, the beginning, phase 2, which we kind of just completed, is when you're going out and asking them, like, what do you love about Dillsburg? And you're getting those stories and that feedback, and you're collecting like thin data where you're just getting, a couple 1 or 2 word answers to that question, and then like what they would call thicker data, where you're having a whole like sit down interview with an individual. And then we are in the process right now of, we have our community heart and soul statements. We took all our initial data and narrowed it down to like, these are our 8 themes that the town of Dillsburg cares about. And we're going back out now to find out, we had asked in the first round a little bit, like, what do you hope to see in Dillsburg in 5 years? But now we're trying to re-engage with people.
And let me speak a little bit to some of the data that we've been collecting. The most fun data we've collected is from the children of our community. We worked with the schools and asked them to, we had these little worksheets that they would draw on of things that they would like to see in their community. And Dillsburg is a very landlocked town. However, beach was one of the top things that they all wanted. And roller coasters, Chick-fil-A's, amusement parks, kind of ran the gamut. But in all of that data, we saw a ton of really valuable themes from the future of our town. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. But that is the heart of what this program is about, is our children who are going to take over for us when we're gone. So, so yeah, out of those themes, we found that these kids really value a place to be seen, and a place to express themselves.
And I wanted, so Isaac, one, thank you for sharing that. I think it's important for us to say that. What is the future? The youth are our future. And I wanted to talk about that tonight, of the challenge and the opportunity of getting younger people to the table. One of the stats that we had run in a report on the Our Towns site was that 15% of younger people felt as if they had never been asked for their input, but yet if asked, more than 2/3 of them would volunteer in their community, but they had just never been approached. And I think that in a place like Erie, and in a place like Gannon University that's actively combating brain drain to try to turn it into a brain gain, I'd like to hear the panel talk about how this process, 1, engages youth, 2, gets to see the value that they bring to the table, 3, see that actualized in a community. Jason, can we start with you on the brain gain, brain drain conversation, youth involved in community heart and soul?
Yeah, I think I'd like to start, first of all, with like the whole idea of what small towns need to do to be the kind of place that people like Heidi and Isaac want to live in. Because I think and Jim was just with us in Bellevue, Iowa, where they've done a really good job of engaging youth and asking them, what would this town need to be like if you were to live here as an adult? And that's the kind of question that's so critical, because we always kind of create this fantasy world that would be good for older adults like myself, but we don't always think about we're not going to be here forever. So how do we create that pipeline? And even just before, Isaac and Heidi and I were talking, and we said, it's not that we don't ever want kids to leave. Kids they do need to leave. And the rural sociologist Ben Winchester from the University of Minnesota has famously said, the fact that 18-year-old kids want to leave your town has nothing to do with your town. It has everything to do with them being 18, right? They want to go out and they want to get these experiences. But what we're all charged with then is building that town they want to come back to. And unless they've been involved as a youth and can see the future and they can see that they've got other caring adults in the town that are stewarding that town for them and making it a town that they want to come back to, they won't come back. But I think, so that's where the brain gain comes in. And I think we have to get over this crutch of like, oh, all of our 18-year-old kids leave. It's like, it's okay, let them leave. But we have to work hard to make them come back and give them a reason to come back. So I think that's really how I frame it. Like, don't get so hung up on that.
And I think there's something of value too of maybe even being encouraging to leave, because you can bring something back with you. You can go have another life experience. Isaac and Heidi, I think you're excellent examples of that. We were moved in a town in South Carolina, Fort Lawn, and what we heard there was they too wanted to get the youth involved in this process, and it took a meeting or two for the table worth of people to look around and say, we've been saying we want to get the youth involved. Where are they at this table? Because they weren't sitting there. And then they said, let us go into the schools and meet them in the schools. And I think that was a similar initiative, Isaac, that you touched upon, of just draw your town. What do you envision your town being? What would you like to see? Alice, where are you seeing in some of the towns that you've worked with successfully navigate the intergenerational experience of older residents and younger residents coming together, ways that they can interact and learn from each other, ways that the youth can be included, and then also those that are more seasoned and experienced in a town can also still be included?
When we were in Williamsport, we brought together high school seniors with senior citizens. And we had them sit down and have a roundtable conversation with each other, talking about what do you love about your town? And so they could see generationally what the differences were, and yet seeing that they still had some commonalities, which was a wonderful thing. So you can bring people together intentionally like that. I know this was not our idea, but one of the great things that was done in a community in Colorado, they couldn't get the millennials. They created beer coasters, and they went to a local brewery, and they put these out, and they had coasters that asked questions. And so everybody would write, and say, what do you want to, it's like take it or leave it. So it was like, what do you want to, take, what do you want to keep, and what do you want to leave from the town? And then they posted them up so everybody coming by could read them. So
all roads lead back to breweries, I think, for looking for solutions. One, it continues to bring back James and Deborah Fallows to Erie because we are blessed with breweries. So brewers, if you're listening there, coasters are a great way to hear from your patrons in your community. This works elsewhere. Before I continue asking my questions, this event is participatory. And so I want to remind the audience, we are collecting your questions. At any given moment, we will transition to begin reading some of those and incorporating those into our conversation. And I can imagine some of them might wonder, well, what does the ideal town look like that might go through the community heart and soul process? How good does it have to be? How bad does it have to be? What kind of criteria exists for something like this? And Jason, we'll start with you on that of maybe the answer is just simply any town that wants it, but is there a common thread that we see in Iowa amongst your towns that have said, this process will work for us?
Well, the first thing that I'll put out there is that Heart and Soul is a almost 100% volunteer-driven process. So a town has to have a certain capacity to drive something like that long-term, because the process can take 18 to 24 months. So it's not really for the faint of heart. Like, you really have to have a lot of people like Heidi and Isaac who are gonna be driving the bus and keep those volunteers motivated and keep the work moving forward. So in Heart and Soul, Alice and I are both coaches. We do a lot of work on readiness, like going into towns and talking with people and building that relationship.
And before you go further, Jason, if I could just stop you, if you can give us in a nutshell, what does a coach look like for Community Heart and Soul?
So Alice and I have both been trained not as project coordinators. We're not like on the ground in the town doing this work. We're not writing the press releases and, organizing the meetings and doing the posters and things. But we work with the Heart and Soul organization to bring the training and the resources and the materials and the guidance to the towns, because we know that a lot of times that experience or that knowledge doesn't necessarily exist in the towns. That's why we're brought in to do it. So we, just like a coach on a football team, kind of stand at the sidelines and coach people and say, zig here and zag there and do this and do that, and help provide those tools and the guidance and the expertise that they can then deploy locally with their own teams in place.
And I think that brings us back to a theme we were hearing that Jim talked about, and that I think we have implicitly said here, is that this is a process with the community, not to or for the community, that it really is that community involvement. Talking about volunteering for a second, I think it's tough not to acknowledge the impact of the pandemic on a process like this, and how I imagine that to be challenging. To work that is often built up shoulder to shoulder. Can you give us the street level view of what the pandemic and navigating through it looked like in Dillsburg? Heidi, Isaac?
Yeah, so at the very beginning of the process, you're supposed to have like a town hall meeting. But we kind of got some funding to do the project in like late 2019, and we're trying to get organized. And then of course the pandemic hit like the beginning of March in 2020. So we never had that first public meeting, and it's kind of haunted us ever since in a little bit of a ways, because even though we've been very vocal like on Facebook and other social media, and even trying to like get the word out via like our town paper and like and even meeting people where they were at the few events that were still happening, like our local farmers market, because that kept going no matter what through the pandemic. We still ran into like people questioning our transparency, or just like a lack of never getting like a real strong group of like volunteers from the get-go, because we weren't doing a big public event. But I don't know, but there's pros and cons to everything. We were talking earlier about how Zoom meetings have become more common. So like our team that we do have, it's a little bit less work for everyone to have a weekly Zoom meeting than traditionally. Before that, we probably would have been like, we have to meet in person and we got to get everyone together. So, but yeah, there definitely have been some challenges, given that it's better, I think Alice said it, to have these conversations face to face with your community members, and you can build stronger connections that way. But.
So just last week, we had a program here as part of the Global Summit where we looked at the Community Schools Initiative, and it's something happening here locally, and it's something happening nationally. And we had Jose Munoz come in, and he's the director for the Coalition for Community Schools at the Institute for Learning and Education. And without going deeply into community schools, it is a community resident-driven process as well to empower schools. But one of the takeaways I had was, in our conversation, somebody had asked the question from the audience: how do you deal with the naysayers, and how do you deal with those that are, not necessarily combative, but just skeptical over and over again? And the anecdote he shared with us was that in Albuquerque, where he was working, they had what was referred to as a pesky parent. And the parent just kept, butting in. And they said, they turned to Jose and said, what do we do about this? And he said, make her a director of one of the community schools. And they offered her that opportunity. And turns out the peskiness was just passion, and perhaps it was misguided. So not to say that that's how it works 100% of the time, but how do you deal with the naysayers, the skeptics? How do you bring people on board, or at least make sure that they know it's an inclusive process and that there is a seat at the table open for them if they choose to take it? Again, Tuckers, I want to stay with you because of that. Isaac, maybe we'll hear from you, and then Alice and Jason lend some insight to that. How do you deal with the naysayers and the skeptics and try to get them to the table, or at least make sure they know it's available?
So if you know me, I am a conflict avoider. So it is not in my nature to run up to somebody who disagrees with me to then jump into a great conversation. So it has been a big challenge for me, especially somebody who has put themselves out there in the public, to walk around and be open to anybody coming up to me and challenging who I am. And so that's been frustrating sometimes, but I've gotten better at going, you know what, this is what we're here for. And I've had a number of conversations that have just been incredible. Again, this is a storytelling, listening project where all of a sudden it's not about me and my position and what I have to share. It's me shutting up and listening to somebody else's story and saying, why is this conversation valuable? Why are we even having this conversation? What are your fears? What are your dreams? What is your passion? And just taking that and going, okay, this is great. What else? Why are you so passionate about that? Why are you so fearful about that? And then all of a sudden, we're maybe not best friends, but we now know each other and we have something in common and have had a connection that we can go back to and build off of. And now there's something that it might not be animosity anymore, because a lot of times we create these narratives in our head about somebody else, and it's just not true. So breaking down those kinds of things has been, I don't know, the easiest way at least. It's not easy, but it's been the way, is just facing your fears and having those conversations with folks.
I think that to me is in line with something that we hear time and again. The president of the JES say, Dr. Ferki Faradi, is we can agree to disagree without being disagreeable, and that's part of what we try to do in these conversations, in that we can find something that we have in common versus focusing chiefly or solely on the things that we don't have in common. Heidi, did you grab the microphone to share a bit as well?
Yeah, I
was
just gonna say that, like, as for Heart and Soul specifically, it also means like constantly being transparent and saying like, this is the process, and like this is like, for us, we had a little bit of grant money, so like this is where we got our grant money from. Like it's we're using it to pay our project coordinator and our interns from the local university, and constantly re-inviting those people, like, because like you said, they can be pesky, or if there's a certain naysayer, you kind of get a feel for someone, whether they actually care about the issue at hand, or there's just like some other issue that you're not going to solve for them. But you have to constantly be like, you can join our team, like it's open to the public. And so you kind of just constantly have to be more inviting and know what to put your energy into as well.
And I think, speaking of active listening, we have great questions from the audience, and I'm going to start to get to some of those. And some I will address to the panel at large. Some I will point to specific panelists, either because the question asker has, or it might seem appropriate. And we will work Jim back into this as well in one way or another. You either take my seat and I'll go to the podium, or you can go to the podium. We'll find a way to reincorporate your voice, Jim, as we welcome that. This one specifically is for you, Jason, and Isaac and Heidi. You were just talking about this, of the storytelling process. This person says, Jason, you mentioned that Heart and Soul is a story-based initiative by and from the people. What is an impactful story from your community that you would like to share?
It is important to acknowledge that, because, and I think what Heidi and Isaac were both talking about too, is not just story listening, but then sharing those stories back out in the community, so that neighbors hear from each other and they hear their neighbors talking about things that they might also care about, and helping build that bond. So that's kind of where some of that transparency comes from. So I think one of the more interesting stories, I think, is in one of the towns I was working in. They were looking at the data that they were gathering, and they noticed that they weren't getting a lot of data from low-income residents in their community. It's one of the hardest nuts to crack, is really to get meaningful feedback and data from low-income folks. They're working 3 jobs, and they're single parents, and all these things. It's just hard to nail them down and get good feedback. So we were really talking about all these strategies. How do we do it? How do we do it? And one of the older fellows in the group said, I think we're trying a little bit too hard to get, now suddenly poor residents are going to be overrepresented in the data. Like, then it'll be all skewed towards what they want. And the counselor from the local elementary school was at the table, and she leaned over and she said, 35% of the kids in our school get free and reduced lunch. He didn't know. He had no idea. As a lifelong resident of that community, he had no idea that that was the case. So that was just a good gut check for him to kind of go, maybe we should keep trying. You know, so I think that was like, and I think in the towns that I've worked in 8 different communities. I see the most transformative change take place on that leadership team, where they're really down in the trenches and they're really looking at the data and they're hearing all the stories and they're really crunching that data. They learn so much about themselves. They learn new skills. They learn about their communities and things. I've just seen so many great transformations happen that way.
Thank you for sharing that, Jason. And speaking of transformations, Jim, this is a question for you. So this audience member is wondering some of the main issues that you saw in towns where they were making big progress before you became familiar with the community heart and soul model, and how that either aligns or is different from what you and Deb have seen on the road now that you've been to community heart and soul towns. So main issues, big progress before community heart and soul that you saw as themes for our towns, and how that is different or aligns with what you see now from community heart and soul towns.
So thanks for that. In the end of our Towns book, there's something we call the 10.5 signs of civic success, which range from having ambitious universities to having a brew pub culture. You know, then that was the half, and that was our way. And the reason I mention that is that no two towns are exactly similar, and you find there are different things that matter in different places. Something that is, you know, before we learned anything about this heart and soul process, towns where you can find some leading person who has thought, I'm going to invest my time, my means, and talking about financial means and other things in building a future for the town. Or people who are just living in the community who think that there's something about this place that I care about for my children and all the rest. So I think that there's this kind of pointillist painting of all the different things that make communities successful, but then there are also, for a certain kind of communities, there is this process, which has been interesting with the heart and soul. So the reason, it's not as if this is a panacea for every place, every community of every size. The reason we have thought it interesting is that it's a place to start. You know, it is, there are ways in which you're going to get, if you're going to get physically fit, or if you're going to improve your financial life, you're going to improve any other parts of your life, it's often helpful to have somebody who say, okay, here's a plan. You do this, then you do that, and if you keep doing it, you'll get, you know, to this destination. So that's what I like about the process. It's a plan. It's not the only plan, but it's a plan.
So that follows up, Jim. I'll keep you at the podium for one more second for one more question. Since you have now returned to Erie, one of the 10.5 signs of civic success that Erie now has that it did not before was a community college. And so we see towns be able to grow their list of what they have. This person's asking, now that you've been here yet again and had one more chance to see our town, what are we still missing? If you had a magic wand, what would Erie get?
I'm going to buy time for a minute and then circle back to actually answering it. Something where, in perverse ways, the wind is at your back, you know, in aviation terms, a tailwind rather than a headwind, is the troubling news for the world about warming climate is good news for a lot of Great Lakes communities. You know, that the Great Lakes communities have what's going to be one of the most precious resources, fresh water. You have a ton of it here, and it's if the climate gets warmer, that's not entirely bad for Erie, and the fact that you have, I think that there are a lot of cities in the Great Lakes. Sandusky is notable in this, also Toledo, who are promoting themselves as America's next great coastal communities. You know, being so, I think there is a coastal shift that will be good for, you know, take advantage of the assets here. On what is missing, I've been here today. So something I've learned in the journalism world is to try to avoid talking about things I don't really know enough to talk about enough about. So after I've spent more than one day on site, I will come back and answer this question.
And we will help get reporting on that.
Yeah.
Thinking about Erie, people do have the questions here. Back to the panel for a second. In talking about youth retention, what have you seen that has been successful through the community heart and soul model? We've talked about how to involve the youth, but either to retain them or reclaim them or have them have a pride of their hometown. Examples that you can share with us. Alice, can we start with you?
Yeah, in Williamsport, we've been transforming into an art town over the last 15 years. And we've seen people in their early 30s coming back because they've gone away to school, they've gotten their careers underway, and they realize that's something that's really a draw for them. And that they're coming back and they're realizing there is great, architecture here that can be reused and revisioned. And so that's something that came out of this that's really been good. And we've had a lot of people, they say, people were saying there was an influx of people coming that were drawing down the society. And they said, well, we're a reflux. We're coming back, but we have a good impact. Anyway.
They can work on that term.
They could work on that term, yes. But they are coming back. They're coming back because it's a town where they want to raise a family. It's a town where they want to invest their money in a home. And so small town America has those values. So many people talk about the small town feel. The fact that you can go downtown to shops and know the shop owners. The fact that you know people in the grocery store, familiar faces, conversations that come up. And it's funny, through the Heart and Soul story sharing and story gathering, people forget how important it is to talk to one another. And when you start talking about where you live and what you love about it, we often don't put that into words. And when somebody asks you to put it into words, it makes it concrete, and then it's in your thought, and that helps bring a narrative, a positive narrative to a community, and that's one of the things I love.
And we saw that in Kershaw, South Carolina, where when we asked several people in 6 words or less, how do you sum up your town? And it was small town, big heart. We heard people say that verbatim again and again. Yeah. When we went there, we asked, where do people go? We'd like to see where people are hanging out. And they told us it was Creighton's Creamery. We said, that sounds delicious. What is that? And it's a boutique ice cream shop on their main street run by a 31-year-old and a 29-year-old couple that chose to be there. We asked, why turn they had a food truck. Why turn your food truck into a brick and mortar space, and why do it in Kershaw? It was like we were speaking in Greek. They said, why not? This is where we want to be. This is home. And if we don't do it, who else is doing it? Jason, are you seeing youth involved like that? Because we've seen that with Isaac and Heidi. They've chosen to go back. They've made a difference. They're leading by example.
Well, one of the things I learned right away doing this work is, and this kind of touches upon what Jim was talking about, like when you hear narratives about rural America, there's a lot of woe is me, like, oh, those poor rural people. Like they probably couldn't make it in New York or whatever, so they're stuck in rural America. And the thing I learned right away was it's not plan B.
It's plan A.
They want to live in small towns. And when you ask, especially youth, when you ask them what would bring you back, like what would help you live in your town, it's exactly what Alice was saying. My family is here. So when you hear that as a leader in a rural community, so that's a really powerful thing. It's going to pull them back. So in order for them to make that a reality, then you have to work hard to build the things that'll make it possible for them to live there. They need childcare. They need housing. They need fun things like art scenes and breweries. And they need, you got to invest in the schools, and you got to build that new middle school. It was good enough for me back in the 50s. It's not good enough for your grandkids. They want a nice, bright, clean, modern middle school for their kids. It's good enough. It's not. So I think those are the kinds of, that's why we have to kind of plan ahead, and because their instinct is they want to make it plan A. They want to live there. But you have to make it a place where they can have a meaningful job and have fun and recreate and be healthy. So
I'm gonna say something cliche maybe, but they need role models. And I think one of the things that I saw growing up, I can remember I was probably 13 or something. I saw my father writing a check at the dinner table to the fire company. And I said, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm writing a check to the fire company. I said, why are you doing that? Isn't that what taxes are for? And he said, no, our taxes don't go to the fire company, and I sure would like for them to show up if our house is on fire. And in that moment, I learned a lesson about being involved in our community and understanding how the community works. I don't think my generation understands how our communities work. They don't understand what our taxes do or don't do. They don't understand where civic organizations get their money and get their volunteers, and how fire companies make rent and are able to keep up with their $1 million fire trucks that they have to purchase every 7 years. There's so much to learn about how our communities work, and every day it's changing. And so I think having a role model and educating our younger folks how to be a resident and a citizen of the town is really, really important.
And I think that's back to that intergenerational opportunity of learning from the past generation. But I think the important part there that Isaac, I hear from you, is getting the lesson that needs to be learned today. And Jason, what I hear from you is that lesson has to be applicable today. It can't be 1950s lesson if it's still not bearing out in modern times. A very specific question, and I think this is because we're in Pennsylvania and we have folks practicing this in Pennsylvania, and I think there are people in perhaps a smaller municipality wondering about this. Could this work here in Erie County? And they're wondering, and Alice, so I want to point this to you, what makes this process different from a comprehensive municipal plan, which is required by PA law? So why do the required thing and also this? How are they different?
Okay. Well, for one, when you're doing a comprehensive plan, nobody asks the open-ended questions like, what do you love about living here? It's a lot about infrastructure, and it's a lot about, things that need to be addressed. Yes, yeah, but PennDOT, all those good infrastructure needs that we have, and they're essential. But when the chairman of our, in Williamsport, the chair of City Council he said, a heart and soul gets to quality of life issues. It's people talking from their heart and not from their head. And so that's how you get to know how people belong to a place. Everybody wants to belong somewhere. And this really gets to that, and it's different. It's not talking about, the nickel and dime things that you're going to do. It's talking about the real quality things that are going to hit you in the heart. And there's just no other way I know of doing it. It's wonderful, these one-on-one conversations. There's great tools for communities in the heart and soul process to guide them through it. But it takes having coaching, because there's a lot of materials, there's a lot of steps. But if you have the willingness, if a community has the will to want to learn more about their community, what people really love, and what's the important matters, it's a wonderful process for bringing that there and energizing people in the process. Because when you ask somebody, tell me what's important to you, a lot of times the first thing they'll say is, why do you want to know? Nobody ever asks me. And so when you take the time to meet somebody where they are and ask them those important questions, it activates them, okay? And so once they've been heard, they realize they have something to say that's worth being heard. And then they're more apt to want to be involved in decisions being made and volunteering in communities. So it's a big process, but it brings it all about.
And to speak to that also, the topic of comprehensive planning, or a comprehensive plan for a town, our town doesn't really have one. We have a multi-municipality plan, and this also kind of speaks to. We live in Dillsburg Borough, which is a municipality, but we did our Dillsburg Heart and Soul project for our school district, which involves, there's another borough, and then there's a couple townships. And they have this kind of group plan, but there's no specific plan for Dillsburg Borough, which is its own small, unique neighborhood, town. And then also, like you said, Jason, in these typical planning avenues of even if you get county input or state input or helpers, there's often not a lot of vision. There's not a lot of vision. I would say there's not a lot of, they're maybe more nitty gritty or maybe doing what's required. But for us, we were Heart and Soul helps you get from the community, this is what we care about. So then how do we write that into our comprehensive plan? How do we, infrastructure can be a quality of life issue, and it's becoming one in Dillsburg. And we've had a lot of issues with PennDOT and people being like, we can't get along or we can't get attention and they just keep kicking the can down the road. But part of the Heart and Soul Project is like, okay, why do people really care about this? What are the actual issues? And like, how do we proactively plan for that?
Well, and especially if the city council or whoever, I'm from Iowa, I don't know what a borough is, but.
We have a lot of government
welcome
here
to
in
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
I don't know what that
There are
is.
38 municipalities in this county alone.
Yeah, I have no idea what that is. But, if whoever's making the decisions, if they have those heart and soul statements, which are these big visionary kind of themes that really bind the town together when they're doing their comp plan, everything that's in that comp plan, you should be able to point to it and say, this makes one of those things better. This one makes 3 of those things better. This one, that one doesn't address any of these things. Maybe that isn't something we should do. Maybe that shouldn't be a priority. So it really, if properly used in that kind of a planning context, it can really help the town make better decisions about its future literally based upon what folks care about. So that's always what I hope, and like in a lot of my heart and soul towns, they've put these statements, these big guiding visionary statements on posters, and they put them up in the city council, or they put them on the table in their council chambers. So I always kind of hope when that resident gets up there, we ought to have this or we ought to have that, they can look at those things and say, that really would match, or yeah, that's not going to work at all, because it doesn't reinforce or strengthen any of these things that folks have told us they care about. So it's not a bad idea, but maybe it shouldn't be a priority.
And I was just going to say that it is a great foundation for a comp plan. It's something to do before a comp plan, because not only do you get all this great information, but you activate citizens so that when you do that comp planning process, they're going to want to participate. And they go hand in hand.
And so, again, hearing the bells and knowing that now it is 9 o'clock, because we did hear them toll 9 times, what I will do here is I will pose a final question to our panelists, and then I'll ask Jim for a few words, a benediction to send us into the evening. Before I do that, though, one, I want to thank you, the audience here in the room, for turning out tonight. We really appreciate you being a part of this conversation, your excellent questions, your attention to this conversation. I want to remind you, the audience here tonight, that tomorrow night we will be at the JES to take a look at Milton, Adams, and Jefferson with our own Reverend Charles Brock, as he joins the amazing list of Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award winners receiving this year's award, James and Deborah Fallows, the award winners in 2018. Then we head to Redlands, where those programs are being live streamed to you in the Erie community. You can live stream those. There's a watch party. More information can be found out about that at jeserie.org. Then it's Thanksgiving, then it's a week off, then we're right back at it. We have 2 programs here at Gannon University. We will learn from John Dickerson. He will talk about his excellent book, The Toughest Job in the World, the American Presidency. We will also learn from Al Hunt and Judy Woodruff, another couple that works together in the same sector in the media. We get a chance to hear from them. And we close out with Alan Carroll, the inventor of Story Maps, a wonderful way to innovatively tell America's stories using maps and graphics and videos. We'll learn from him. Those are December 11th, 12th, and 13th, so we invite you to register for those. Come back here to this campus for those programs. We're excited to have those. Now, I want to thank the panel immensely. I will thank them again as we exit. The final question here, and Jason, you talked about this, of the rural narrative, the poor rural folks. This is Plan B or C or D. And here tonight's title of this event is How America's Towns Are Writing the Future of the Country. And so what does that future look like as the towns are writing that future where you are? I want to ask that to each of the panelists as quickly as you can. What do you see that future being? Jason, if we can start with you.
Well, I think the most potential that I see is that, and I've heard lots of people talk about this in small towns, one of the reasons I moved back to my small town is I can make a difference here. I can actually get involved, and it's valued and needed, and it's like that big fish in a small pond kind of thing, but it really matters a lot. So to me, I think that's where, as far as like the future of our country, there's a lot more self-determination possible in a small town. So I think it really has that idea. You think from the national narrative, it's hopeless. But it's not hopeless in small towns because you can make a difference.
Jason, thank you. Alice, that narrative.
Yeah, that narrative, I think the more people come together and share their ideas, talk with one another, just find forums, ways to get together and discuss things that are important to you. You know, humanity is one of stories. We tell stories, and we've done that for eons. And the more we get back to that, I think the more we connect with one another, and that's really what's going to carry us through into the future.
Alice, thank you. Isaac.
I think one solution is that we have more meals together, and we can share our thoughts and get back to I don't know, sort of a more sane approach to relationships and community building that starts with a meal or starts with some sort of third place in their community that they can be a part of and feel like they belong, and then start building those relationships there.
And that third place, which can be an ice cream shop on your main street, can be a bakery, can be a craft brewery, as we've heard several times. Heidi, what does the future look like to you?
I think for us, particularly for our town, it is about being proud of what's been there in the past, but also, like you said, empowering people to be the change they want to see, and to if they want to start a business, start the business. If you want to make a new park, help the township realize they need a new park. So empowering the people that have chosen to be there, to follow their ideas, and then also telling those stories back to the people that we graduated high school with that are now living in DC or New York or San Francisco, and being like, hey, you can work from home now, so you should come back to Dillsburg. Like, you're getting paid over the internet. So yeah, that's what it looks like.
So Heidi, Isaac, Alice, Jason, thank you so much. Folks, I'm going to ask you to hold your applause because remember, we have the benediction before we leave. But again, I want to thank tonight's sponsor and our host venue, Gannon University, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Iwanenko, Dr. Jeffrey Bloodworth, and the whole team at Gannon that helps us make this all possible. And of course, the students that come and partake in these programs as well. A huge thanks to them. A thanks to the JES team under the leadership of our president, Dr. Furky Faradi, and all of our volunteers that help these events. Jim, your final words for us tonight.
Yes, my final words, I have a historical thought, a personal thought, and a benediction. The historical thought is there are eras in American history where the landscape just is changed. After the Civil War and the opening up of the Northern Plains to settlement and all the immigrants coming in, there was a whole different pattern of both cities and the countryside. The beginning is the Great Black Migration early in the 20th century from the south to the north. The post-World War II GI Bill migration, et cetera, et cetera. Another one of those changes is going on right now. After the pandemic, people are choosing more where they want to be and how they want to live. So communities that are places where people want to be, that's going to be the new natural resource. And we've heard from that. So that's my historical thought. My personal thought is, can you wonder for even a second why Deb and I felt so inspired by traveling the country and hearing people talk about towns like Dillsburg and Dubuque and Williamsport and Erie and all the rest? The country is full of creativity and insight, and that is something that the country needs to know about itself. The benediction, just before we applaud, I want you, everybody in this room, to join me in turning around for you, looking at that camera and saying, "Good night, Deb." Good night. So good night, Deb, and please join me in congratulating Ben and this wonderful panel.